The Moscow trials were a series of show trials held in the Soviet Union at the instigation of Joseph Stalin between 1936 and 1938. The Moscow trials included the case of the Trotskyite-Zinovievite Terrorist Center, the case of the Anti-Soviet Trotskyist Center, and the case of the anti-Soviet Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites. The defendants of these were Old Bolshevik party leaders and top officials of the Soviet secret police. Most defendants were charged under Article 58 of the RSFSR Penal Code with conspiring with the Western powers to assassinate Stalin and other Soviet leaders, dismember the Soviet Union, and restore capitalism. The Moscow trials led to the execution of many of the defendants. They are generally seen as part of Stalin's Great Purge, an attempt to rid the party of current and prior oppositionists, especially but not exclusively Trotskyists, and any leading Bolshevik cadre from the time of the Russian Revolution or earlier, who might even potentially become a figurehead for the growing discontent in the Soviet populace resulting from Stalin's mismanagement of the economy. Stalin's hasty industrialization during the period of the first five-year plan and the brutality of the forced collectivization of agriculture had led to an acute economic and political crisis in 1928–33 and to enormous suffering on the part of the Soviet workers and peasants. Stalin was acutely conscious of this fact and took steps to prevent it taking the form of an opposition inside the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to his increasingly autocratic rule. Background: early show trials. Before the major Soviet show trials in Moscow during 1937 and 1938 as a result of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union purges, other trials served to keep the industrial sphere in control and to perfect the show trial process. Some of the major early show trials of the 1922 Moscow trial of socialist revolutionaries just a week after the Criminal Code was adopted: the Shakti Trial of 1928, the Industrial Party Trial in 1930, the 1931 Menshevik Trial, and the Metrovikas Trial in 1933. As the first major trial of innocent non-politicals, the Shakti Trial was particularly important in shaping the way show trials would function when guilt was not genuine. Shakti Trial. On May 18, 1928, the Shakti Trial began in Moscow. It involved German and Russian coal mining engineers from the small town of Shakti in the Donbass near the Ukrainian border. The presiding judge was Andrei Vyshinsky and the prosecutor was Nikolai Krylenko, both of whom came to epitomize the show trial process. However, the Shakti Trial did not work entirely smoothly. Out of 53 defendants, 20 pleaded guilty, 11 wavered back and forth or partially confessed, and the rest did not admit guilt at all. Those who did not confess did not hide their distaste for the regime, but argued that they could do their jobs conscientiously without letting the political opinions influence the work. The trial was delayed for some months as the government attempted to find someone to be a cooperative chief defendant, because prospective leaders kept backing out. Although minor defendants could simply sign a false confession and perhaps make a short statement, a lot more was required of a chief defendant. They would be the main person confessing on stand and would face the brunt of the cross-interrogation. The performance had to be very convincing to the crowds the show was intended for, or else the show trial would be nearly pointless. Therefore, a chief defendant had to either have strong incentives or be loyal to the regime and willing to play his part. In the Shakti Trial, the first major non-political trial, The secret police was not yet adept at motivating defendants into cooperating, so it took them a long time and several false starts before they finally found the chief defendants. Show trials depended upon confessions extracted based on incentives, threats, and torture. So if some did not admit guilt, the trial would be exposed for the sham it was. Most Soviet citizens and even many communist leaders and foreign observers assumed at this point in the legal history of the Soviet Union that no one would confess if they were not guilty. They knew that although torture would be applied, no one could be forced to confess, and many of those accused came from suspect social backgrounds or had personal histories of opposition to the state, so they did not doubt the confessions and impassioned statements made. In addition, the concept of the show trial was in its infancy, so few people were hardened enough to see past the lies and understand the reasons why someone might falsely confess. Even though the Shakti Trial led to more and better orchestrated show trials, the tendency of defendants to suddenly and bravely retract the confessions in the middle of the trial showed to the world that the trial was false. A major reason why these industrial trials occurred was the state of the industrial sector at the time. Since the state was still so new and education levels had been so low before the revolution, there were not many proletarian engineers, so industry and mining had to rely on bourgeois Tsarist-era specialists and German engineers. Stalin could not trust these people, so by means of this trial and others he sought to make them fear the might of the Soviet state. The country was industrializing so quickly and many new workers were so inexperienced that they frequently made mistakes. In the eyes of the communist leaders, it was hard to tell apart sabotage and mistakes, so in order to discourage both, everything that went wrong was labeled sabotage or wrecking and made a serious offense. Show trials were considered a major aspect of Soviet strategy for discouraging oppositionist behaviors. The Shakti Trial was the first major attempt at forestalling attempts at industrial sabotage by making an example of a few engineers. Nearly 100 carefully chosen foreign and Soviet journalists reported on the proceedings. More than 30,000 Soviets were chosen to watch portions of the trial. The principal Soviet delegations to watch were made up of workers, Komsomol activists, and groups from other parts of the Soviet Union. The trial was also filmed for newsreels and a documentary film. 50 Russian mining engineers were accused, along with 3 German specialists prominently accused. 2 Germans were released before trial. Since there were only 1,100 mining engineers in the USSR at the time, this trial was a serious loss. Among the Soviets charged was L.G. Rabinovich, a former engineer who Lenin put in charge of revitalizing the coal industry. Some of the Germans did not even understand Russian well enough to know what they were confessing to. However, Rabinovich and a few others fought back against the accusations and succeeded in referring a few technical questions to an outside commission. The only evidence produced were confessions and statements by subordinates. Fabricated letters, which had originally been mentioned, were not ultimately produced at the trial. At 1:30 a.m. on July 7, Andrei Vyshinsky read out the verdicts. 4 of the 53 defendants were acquitted, including the 2 Germans Ernst Otto and Max Meyer. 4 more were judged guilty but given suspended sentences, including Wilhelm Badstieber. Krylenko had demanded 22 death sentences, but in the end only 11 were sentenced to death, and 6 of those 11 were commuted to prison terms. 38 went to prison, most with terms of 4 to 10 years, including Rabinovich, who received a 6-year term, but some received lesser terms of 1 to 3 years. Defendants' tendency to proclaim innocence in the middle of the trial demonstrated and ensured that the trial was not as tightly scripted as the Party would have liked, or as trials would become later. In addition, the high number of defendants who never confessed, and the disparity between the sentences Krylenko desired and those that Vyshinsky proclaimed, demonstrate that not every aspect of the trial was predetermined. Some aspects of the unpredictability of the trial eroded its legitimacy for careful observers, but other aspects actually made the confessions seem more genuine, as if it appeared that people had not been forced to confess. When some spontaneously retracted the confessions, many logically assumed that those who did not retract the confessions were guilty. The Shakti Trial was the first major attempt at a Moscow show trial. It paved the way for further political show trials, but also in its flaws shows that the concept of a show trial was still a work in progress at this stage. Industrial Party Trial. The successor of the Shakti Trial in preparing for the show trials of 1937 and 1938 was the Prom Party. It was orchestrated and presided over by Andrei Vyshinsky and Nikolai Krylenko, just as the Shakti Trial had been. It took place from November 25 to December 7, 1930 in Moscow. It was better organized with less chance of spontaneous reversals of confessions of the declamations against the regime than those that occurred during the Shakti Trial, allowing a full stenographic report to be produced and dispersed across the country for mass consumption. There were only 8 carefully selected defendants, avoiding the mistakes of the Shakti Trial, wherein a large number of defendants led to a lack of control over the testimony. These defendants were Leonid Ramzan, director of the Thermal Technical Institute in Moscow and professor at the Moscow Higher Technical School, N.F. Tchaikovsky, professor of metallurgy at the Moscow Higher Technical School and chairman of the Metallurgical Advisory Council of the Supreme Soviet of the National Economy, I.A. Kalinikov, vice chairman of the Production Center of the State Planning Commission and a professor at the Military Aviation Academy, V.A. Laryev, chairman of the Fuels Section of Gosplan, A.A. Fedotov, head of the Textile Research Institute and an engineering professor, S.V. Kuprianov, a technical director in the textile industry, K.V. Sitnin, an engineer of the All-Union Textile Syndicate, and V.I. Ochkin, a member of the Scientific Research Section of Vysenka and Scientific Secretary of the Thermal Technical Institute under Ramzan. There was little to no written evidence, so the trial relied almost entirely upon confessions. The prosecutor accused the defendants of attempting to form a political party to agitate for their industrial interests and therefore conspiring, with approximately 2,000 fellow engineers, to take over the government of the Soviet Union. The prosecutor claimed that they were aided by Western and dissident interests. The true reason for their prosecution appears to have been the support for capitalistic policies and opposition to changes in the education system. The problem was that even though the strategy of relying on willing and improvised confessions gave an air of authenticity to the confessions, it also made them more unpredictable. Some even claimed to have met with émigré Russian industrialists who were known to be dead. The star of the trial was Leonid Ramzan, who had a history of opposition to the Bolsheviks in the early days of the revolution but who was notable for cooperating enthusiastically in the trial. The result was that 5 people were sentenced to death, a sentence that was committed to long prison terms, while the others were sentenced to other differing terms in prison. Ramzan, who unlike the others had not cooperated out of fear but rather out of zeal, was allowed to continue working during his imprisonment and was amnestied in 1932. He eventually received the 1943 Stalin Prize for his invention of a new technique in thermal technology and the Order of Lenin, some of the highest awards available in the Soviet Union. The point of this trial was not the sentences but rather to make a political point. The Shakti and Shotty trials were organized to intimidate industrial specialists, many of whom had no love for the Communist Party, and to draw them into line. They could not easily tell mistakes and sabotage apart, so they sought to prevent both through a massive display. In the process, Vyshinsky, Krylenko, and others refined the show trial process, which would reach its apogee in 1937–1938 with the political trials of some of the highest Communist Party officials. Background to the Moscow trials of 1937–1938. Stalin, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev formed a ruling troika in early 1923 after Vladimir Lenin had become incapacitated from a stroke. In the context of the series of defeats of communist revolutions abroad which left the Russian Revolution increasingly isolated in a backward country, enabled the Troika to effect the marginalization of Leon Trotsky in an internal party political conflict over the issue of Stalin's theory of socialism in one country. It was Trotsky who most clearly represented the wing of the CPSU leadership which claimed that the survival of the revolution depended on the spread of communism to the advanced European economies, especially Germany. This was expressed in his theory of permanent revolution. A few years later, Zinoviev and Kamenev joined the United Front in an alliance with Trotsky which favored Trotskyism and opposed Stalin specifically. Consequently, Stalin allied with Nikolai Bukharin and defeated Trotsky in a power struggle. Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929, and Kamenev and Zinoviev temporarily lost the membership in the Communist Party. Zinoviev and Kamenev, in 1932, were found to be complicit in the Utin affair and again were temporarily expelled from the Communist Party. In December 1934, Sergei Kirov was assassinated and, subsequently 15 defendants were found guilty of direct or indirect involvement in the crime and were executed. Zinoviev and Kamenev were found to be morally complicit in Kirov's murder and were sentenced to prison terms of 10 and 5 years, respectively. Both Kamenev and Zinoviev had been secretly tried in 1935, but it appears that Stalin decided that, with suitable confessions, the fate could be used for propaganda purposes. Genrik Ugoda oversaw the interrogation proceedings. The trial was held from August 19 to August 24, 1936 in the small October Hall of the House of the Unions, and there were 16 defendants. The main charge was forming a terror organization with the purpose of killing Joseph Stalin and other members of the Soviet government. They were tried by the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR, with Vasily Ulrich presiding. The prosecutor general was Andrei Vyshinsky, a former member of the Mensheviks who in 1917 had signed an order to arrest Lenin. Defendant Ivan Nikitich Smirnov was blamed by his co-defendants for being the leader of the center which planned Kirov's assassination. He, however, had been in prison since January 1933 and refused to confess. Another defendant, the Old Bolshevik, S. Goltzman, was accused at the trial of the 16 of conspiring with Trotsky in Copenhagen at the Hotel Bristol in 1932, where Trotsky was giving a public lecture. A week after the trial, it was revealed by a Danish Social Democratic newspaper that the hotel had been demolished in 1917. All the defendants were sentenced to death and were subsequently shot in the cellars of Lubyanka prison in Moscow. Trial of the 16. In December 1935, the original case surrounding Zinoviev began to widen into what was called the Trotskyite-Zinovievite Center. Stalin allegedly received reports that correspondences from Trotsky were found among the possessions of one of those arrested in the Wyden probe. Consequently, Stalin stressed the importance of the investigation and ordered Nikolai Yezhov to take over the case and ascertain if Trotsky was involved. In June 1936, Yagoda reiterated his belief to Stalin that there was no link between Trotsky and Zinoviev, but Stalin promptly rebuked him. In July 1936, Zinoviev and Kamenev were brought to Moscow from an unspecified prison. They were interrogated and denied being part of any Trotsky-led conspiracy. Yezhov appealed to Zinoviev's and Kamenev's devotion to the Soviet Union as old Bolsheviks and advised them that Trotsky was fomenting anti-Soviet sentiment amongst the proletariat in the world. Furthermore, this loss of support in the event of a war with Germany or Japan could have disastrous ramifications for the Soviet Union. To Kamenev specifically, Yezhov showed him evidence that his son was subject to an investigation that could result in his son's execution. Kamenev and Zinoviev agreed to confess on condition that they receive a direct guarantee from the entire Politburo that the lives and those of the families and followers would be spared. When they were taken to the supposed Politburo meeting, they were met by only Stalin and Kliment Voroshilov. Stalin explained that they were the commission authorized by the Politburo, and Stalin agreed to the conditions in order to gain the desired confessions. Trial of the Anti-Soviet Trotskyist Center. The second trial occurred between January 23 and January 30, 1937. This second trial involved 17 lesser figures including Karl Radek, Yuri Piatakov and Grigory Sokolnikov. 13 of the defendants were eventually executed by shooting. The rest received sentences in labor camps. Radek was spared as he implicated others, including Nikolai Bukharin, Alexei Rykov, and Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, setting the stage for the trial of military and trial of the 21. Radek provided the pretext for the purge on a massive scale with his testimony that there was a third organization separate from the cadres which had passed through school, as well as semi-Trotskyites, quarter Trotskyites, 1/8 Trotskyites, people who helped us, not knowing of the terrorist organization but sympathizing with us, people who from liberalism, from a front against the party, gave us this help. By the third organization, he meant the last remaining former opposition group called Rightists led by Bukharin, whom he implicated by saying, "I feel guilty of one thing more. Even after admitting my guilt and exposing the organization, I stubbornly refused to give evidence about Bukharin. I knew that Bukharin's situation was just as hopeless as my own, because our guilt, if not juridically, then in essence, was the same. But we are close friends, and intellectual friendship is stronger than other friendships. I knew that Bukharin was in the same state of upheaval as myself. That is why I did not want to deliver him bound hand and foot to the People's Commissariat of Home Affairs. Just as in relation to our other cadres, I wanted Bukharin himself to lay down his arms." At the time, many Western observers who attended the trials said that they were fair and that the guilt of the accused had been established. They based this assessment on the confessions of the accused, which were freely given in open court, without any apparent evidence that they had been extracted by torture or drugging. Joseph E. Davies, the U.S. ambassador, wrote in Mission to Moscow, in view of the character of the accused, the long terms of service, the recognized distinction in the profession, the long-continued loyalty to the communist cause, it is scarcely credible that the brother officers should have acquiesced in their execution, unless they were convinced that these men had been guilty of some offense. It is generally accepted by members of the diplomatic corps that the accused must have been guilty of an offense which in the Soviet Union would merit the death penalty. The Bukharan trial 6 months later developed evidence which, if true, more than justified this action. Undoubtedly those facts were all full known to the military court at this time. Trial of the generals and the Tukhachevsky affair. The Tukhachevsky affair was a secret trial before a military tribunal of a group of Red Army generals, including Mikhail Tukhachevsky, in June 1937. It featured the same type of frame-up of the defendants, and it is traditionally considered one of the key trials of the Great Purge. Mikhail Tukhachevsky and the senior military officers Iona Yukia, Iron Muborovich, Robert Eidman, August Kork, Vito Ivat Putner, Boris Feldman, and Vitaly Primakov were accused of anti-communist conspiracy and sentenced to death. They were executed on the night of June 11, June 12, immediately after the verdict delivered by a special session of the Supreme Court of the USSR. This trial triggered a massive purge of the Red Army.